the office, OSP, in one of its major roles, reviews and submits grants on behalf of faculty and staff at the university. This last panel talks about experiences with large grants and collaborative projects. And when I talk about collaborative, I generally mean multi-institutional projects, faculty, both at AU and at other institutions. It could be an international context, faculty at AU and faculty in a foreign country. But like the last panel, this panel will be, I'm going to start them off with one basic question and then see how the discussion goes, and that will trigger additional questions and additional lines of inquiry. So we're going to go from 3:30 to 4:30. Panelists up here to my immediate left is David Kearns, Associate Professor in the Department of Psychology. Next to him we have Mark Laubach, who's Associate Professor in Biology. To his left is Chuck Lewis, Professor in the School of Communication. And on the far end is Ed McGuire, who's a Professor in the Department of Justice, Law, and Criminology. The first question I'd maybe start out, and David, maybe you can take a whack at the first answer. AU has some large grants, and we certainly have collaborations across different universities, and even in an international context. But maybe if you could speak what your experience in going after large grants and collaborative grants with your colleagues at other institutions.
Actually, I don't have any experience with collaborators from other institutions. All my collaborators are here at AU.
Okay.
My experience, I'm wrapping up one NIH R01 grant now and just beginning a new project. Collaborating has been easy. It's been people within my own department.
Okay. What has that, I guess the follow-up question is, what has your experience been in terms of the process, in terms of conceptualizing the idea, in terms of the grantsmanship of the product as it moves forward? Can you speak to that?
Yes, it's usually we have worked on smaller scale projects. First, we have some experience, a working history together, working on experiments, publishing papers together, and then somebody will come up with an idea, or the two or three of us will come up with an idea and decide to turn it into a grant application.
Okay.
Same question.
Yes.
My experiences have been, I've had a few promising collaborative grants through NIH, through DARPA, which is DoD funding, and other collaborations that have been part of grants I've had myself, or others that had money of their own, we've been able to work out, you can list them in a grant. NSF, for example, has a collaborative, in my field, neuroscience, collaborative research and computational neuroscience program, which is very successful. The reviewer for that, haven't had one of the grants. I've had collaborators in Canada. They don't take part in that. So we had to kind of work out a way to collaborate, naming them in the grant, just collaborating through our own monies together. The DARPA grant I had early when I started, I was at Yale School of Medicine, and when I first got my job there was a lot of money, around 2001. And we worked on a project with Came Prosthetics, brain-machine interfaces. How do you get a brain hooked up to a computer? And a person may not be able to move their arms or have ALS. And we were able to get some money from DARPA to try to continue that. That money lasted for a few years, but there's a couple of wars that happened that just didn't continue the way we like. And I was involved in an aging center grant that was at Yale, where it was across about 6 different groups, run by Amy Arnston, the neuropathology department there. So each person had different techniques, different expertise, human, primate, rodent models of aging, so we kind of work together on that. In terms of how you write those, it requires a lot of work with the person who's the primary, really, to keep people working in a good way together, making reasonable assignments for each person. The biggest problem we faced in those projects was the issue that I still face in my teaching here is Macintosh computers, which format things differently than Windows computers, and people who use Word or other programs. It's always been a problem to get people that know
because I had a prior life outside American University. I started and ran the Center for Public Integrity and raised about $30 million from private foundations. We actually investigated government occasionally, so we didn't take government money. And I now run the investigative reporting workshop at a school, communication, and we actually also still investigate government occasionally, and corporations, and you name it. We have now raised about $8 or $9 million in about 6 or 7 years, all from private foundations. The collaboration I did a few years ago at the Center for Public Integrity involved 3 research groups, the Center for Public Integrity, the Center for Responsive Politics, better known online as Open Secrets, tracking all the money of politicians, and the National Institute for Money and State Politics in Montana that had state influence-related data for the entire nation. We were looking at, this is before dark money, but it was the period where money was starting to move through party committees, 200 to 300 of them in the country. You wouldn't be able to tell where the money actually had been given, from whom, and when, and why. None of that was in any records because they would just transfer to the other committees, which wasn't coincidental. Anyway, the challenge there were the different methodological approaches to the data. The folks in Montana had a little different way of doing it than the folks in Washington, and 3 different organizations, Max versus Microsoft, Word, Excel, all that stuff. We had all those kinds of issues. Here, our stuff has all been directly just us, and it's been simpler in that regard. It has been a challenge to deal with folks. When I ran the center, I could do it all myself. Now, so the process is a little more elaborate, but I can stop there for now.
Thank you.
So one of the great pleasures, I think, of my professional life is the opportunity to be able to envision a project, think about the team that is just the right, absolute right people to do that project, and then bring them together to whether it's apply for funding or to just bring a team together for funding that I've already got. In my field, it seems things may be a little bit different than in other fields. My seeking funding is sometimes very opportunistic. It's, a phone call seems to create the window for an opportunity, and the opportunity then leads, in one case, to a $5.6 million contract with a foreign government. That project ended up, who knew? That project ended up becoming, this was when I was at a different university. I was at George Mason, but we had subcontracts with, I think, 5 universities. And that, just managing that administratively can be pretty complex. But for me, I don't have, I may have a different mentality about external funding than I do about publishing. So for publishing, you have journal rankings and impact factors and these kinds of things. And you want to aim your publications at the best possible outlets and ones that are cited most and most well-known and have the best name and so forth. I absolutely do not have that mentality when it comes to getting external funding. As long as it's a funding source that's ethically appropriate and so forth, then it doesn't matter to me once we get outside ethical questions, who's paying for my research. So, I know sometimes a lot of premium is placed on, peer-reviewed, externally funded grants, for instance, from prestigious institutions. That would be great, and sometimes I do that, but at the same time, I'm perfectly happy to wiggle my way into funding opportunities where I'm not competing against anybody. I much prefer that, right? Chances of funding are much greater. And so even though we're talking about grants, a lot of what I've done over the years has not been, grants haven't been a vehicle, although I've certainly done plenty of that, but also contracts of various types with different institutions or governments or whatever the case may be.
Thank you. Any questions? Cheryl.
Well, I posed this to the junior faculty just a little bit ago, and I kind of want to pose the same question to you guys is, start to finish, when you're thinking of a project idea, or you're thinking of a grant idea, what is your method of finding the right funder? And you just mentioned, you know, sometimes it's just a conversation, but, you know, is it going to conferences? Is it, you know, what is your method that has been the most successful for each of you?
Well, I'm easy because NIH is pretty much the only game in town for what I do. There was one small foundation, but they gave really small grants, so.
But did you have to engage with program officers before you found the right, you know, center to go to or institute to go to?
Well, more engaging with program officers to find out whether what I had in mind was something that might be fundable. But yeah, the kind of research I do is pretty narrow and limited to NIH, National Institute on Drug Abuse in particular. So.
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. You have to think of with NIH, you have to think about the institute, what they're looking to fund, so you can't just put some random in. You have to design a study that has translational impact, and you got to do pilot studies to get it ready for that. So it has been useful to talk to people at different institutes. And one of the things we moved towards a couple years ago is looking at food and reward, and value of food, economics of food in the brain. And the problem was that there was no branch of NIH that was responsible for that kind of research. NIDA didn't want to fund it. Mental health didn't want to fund it unless you had an eating disorder. Thankfully, the branch digestive disorders, kidney function, NIDDK has now created a neurobiology of obesity program, basic biology of eating, so that these two programs at least can help fund some of that. There's Seth Klarman, who's a hedge fund manager in Boston, started a foundation to fund this, and through just knowing some people, found out about that, so we get some money from them for a couple of years. But it's hard. I think you have to get a good science idea. And science is not being the same as what the field. You got to not only come up with the idea, but then you have to do something to show that you can do an experiment to test the idea and have data to take it seriously. So it's a lot of work. It can take a couple of years. So pilot grants are so useful. Small pilot grants. University funds like these Mellon courses now. This is great because you need a few $1,000s or more, maybe 10, 20, to really be able to do legitimate, good pilot stuff.
So my strange world is the private foundation world, and there's a subset within that that's into small d democracy and accountability and transparency and all these kumbaya sounding values that are important to all of us. And journalism, no one funds journalism per se, which is what I do, but they do care about those issues. And it's kind of a strange thing to acknowledge, but I've been in the same approximate space for about 25 years now at a different institution the last 9 years here at American. And those foundations, the program officers sometimes come and go, or the presidents of the foundations. But there is a stalwart group of philanthropic funders that deeply care about those issues. Some include the Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the MacArthur Foundation, especially in my case, and the Rockefeller, various foundations, and many others. But so the challenge there is, yes, you do talk to those folks, but we also, 2/3 of the funding I raised at the Center for Public Charity was not general support, which is nirvana. It was project specific, and it turns out that all journalism and most public interest matters can be divided into social network subject areas that all have funding around them, shall we say. And so we have always used the Foundation Center and the Foundation Directory very carefully until she just retired for the 3rd time. I had a development director who had raised money for decades, and there's a science to that itself. Who's on the board, what's their average gift, what is the pattern of giving, how much money do they generally give, how much do they have, how long they've been around, all that kind of stuff. You obviously do extensive research before you have a single meeting. Then, so there's a whole process to navigating the process, and you can't ever do it over the handsome. Anyone who says, just submit it online, it'll never happen. I mean, you gotta, it involves humans.
That's a perfect segue to my comments. I mean, it really does involve humans, right? And so I think two very proactive things that, quite frankly, just a lot of people just don't do this. They either maybe don't know to do this or don't bother doing it. One is just relationship building. So for me, all of the major funding agencies that pay for the kinds of research that my colleagues and I do are located in Washington, D.C. I'm located in Washington, D.C., so how hard is it for me to go downtown every once in a while and go out to breakfast or dinner or drinks or whatever it is with somebody, or even just something as simple as I completed a new piece of research, so I send it to that person, so I'm on their radar screen. More than once in my career, as the fiscal year is coming to a close and an agency has leftover money that they know they need to spend, I get a phone call that says, so, we didn't get an application from you in our request for proposals this year. Why not? And, they're not allowed to sort of come right out and say it, but they're dropping some pretty big hits, right? And often this turns out to be challenging for whichever university I've been at any of the sponsored programs or sponsored projects offices, because typically these things have a very narrow window, like get us a proposal in 3 days. There's no OSP anywhere in the country that wants to hear that, like, get us a proposal in 3 days. Yeah, and so those investments in building relationships pay enormous dividends. And then the second one, and so I come at this from a different perspective. So I'm on the standing review panel for the National Institute of Justice, which is the major funding agency for most criminology and criminal justice research. So for several years, I've sat in the room and been one of the reviewers for, at this point, probably hundreds of proposals. And this is if you ever have the opportunity to be in that position, first of all, there's no better way to become competitive at submitting really solid grant applications than reviewing grant applications and learning the lessons from your colleagues who are really not doing it well and the ones who are doing it well. So, you have these think tanks, and I think about the RAND Corporation is the one that comes to mind, where, this is an organization that knows how to fill out a grant proposal. That damn thing is damn near perfect, right? They know exactly what to say. This is down to a science for them. And you really learn a lot from seeing agencies, or not agencies, but institutions and think tanks, and then the really sophisticated individual scholars and teams of scholars who just do this so well. And then just seeing how the process works from inside the judgment chamber, if you will, really is very helpful. Sometimes I'll review a proposal that looks really good to me, and then hearing the ways my colleagues on the grant review panel think about it, I never in a million years would have thought about some of the issues that they bring up. But then when I'm filling out my own grant applications, I am now thinking about those issues. So to the extent that you can really familiarize yourself with the review process and even potentially become a part of it, I think it would help you.
I have a question. Seems to be a change over the, I'd say, past 5 years, and it seems like the model is changing for the big federal funders, from giving a big chunk of money to one person, one institution, or to pushing for interdisciplinary collaboration, like across the board. I know I'm new to AU, but in my previous institution, we did a lot of these. Sometimes they were within the institution, sometimes they were outside the institution, but it seems to have a big positive impact in academia. I was just curious about your perspective on that.
I'm not really seeing so much of that in my area. It's a big push, at least in the social sciences generally, from what I've seen. But from the funding agencies that I deal with, that hasn't really been so much of an issue, so my apologies.
In my field, it's very different. And so neuroscience, what is neuroscience? Neuroscience these days means a lot of things. Just like fluff you see in the news. There's serious neuroscience, and it's not just biology or psychology. In fact, it's computer science, physics. This there's a lot of math now, a lot of quantitative techniques, and actually open source. Open journalism is a new evolving field, open source science, getting your numeric code out there, putting the data out there. And this has become a strong driver for the collaborative research projects through NSF and NIH, that they jointly host this collaborative research competition. You must share your data, you must share your code. Government's paying for it. I feel that's a good thing, but also as a you could say competitor, colleague, friend, whatever, I like to see what they do so I understand it. And sometimes it's hard just with words to understand how someone's analyzed data. We've seen in the press recently a lot of retractions in neuroscience, and statistics in general are not that great. Actually, your institution look into some of this. There's some things published that push really hard, and to me, I'm very nervous about that. So I like this idea of not just having a statistician involved. That doesn't really make it. A colleague who thinks quantitatively can make a huge difference in a project. I think it's a great thing for my field too.
Can I jump in? We have a really good math and stats department, and whenever I see the people pull some of the math and stats
Faculty in, I think it's a great thing, and they really try to make use of them. So I do recommend that department and just getting to know the different faculty in that department, because they know what they're doing, and other departments are doing that.
One question that was asked in the first panel, and it's good to throw it out to you, in the context of collaborative grants, larger grants, was the whole issue of psychology of rejection. When the grant submissions you send out don't get funded. The first panel were individuals that kind of related what it was like and how it positively impacted how they approach grants, or any negativity associated with the rejection. I think if anyone here could talk a little bit about that, it'd be good to know.
I could definitely talk about rejection. NIH, I guess within the last 10 years ago, success levels or the percentile that you need to get funded has dropped from something in the 20s to less than 10%. So you have to be prepared for rejection. It stings, but you have to learn from it and keep trying. In my case, it took I don't know, a good half dozen or more attempts, and slowly the percentile came down until it came under the pay line. And learning from each of those attempts. None of them have been worthless. I learned something important from each of the failed attempts.
Thank you.
One comment, just from my own experiences, learning how to thick skin and not take it personally. And where I was first hired in a time when there's a lot of money for scientific research, the decision of how to review people that had been there for 3 years was based on how their grant groups were. It's one of the major factors. That's not possible to do to people now because the funding rates are so low. And for me, I came in right at that time, so it made it really easy to look at that as a silly idea, because it is almost random when you're down at 10%. It is random at 10%. But taking it, don't take it personal. You can't. If you get down about it, then it's just not a good personality trait. You just have to roll with it. It's got to be negative most of the time. Elation, you get it.
As I noted, I've never tried to raise federal money or received it, but having started the Center for Public Integrity from my house, I did not get a six-figure grant for 5 years, and I didn't get a letter returned for 3 years, and so I totally agree that you can't take it personally, and you've got to just accept that you're a new entity and you're establishing yourself, and you'll get known over time, and so you network at things like conferences, and you eventually meet these folks. And one other observation for the kind of work I do, the profile of the organization is quite, or the work itself, or the person is relevant. I once had one of many interns track the media trajectory of the Center for Public Integrity over the first 10 years with its funding. And they were like a direct overlap line of the two. They both went up. And the better known we got
So my field may be a little bit peculiar when it comes to this, and so I feel very confident when I write grant proposals that the grant proposal will largely deal with the concerns that would be raised by the scientists and the statisticians reviewing the grant. We have a peculiarity in my field where a lot of the grants are also reviewed by practitioners and policymaker type people, and so criminal justice officials and so forth. And when it comes to that side of who's reviewing the process, sometimes it really does feel just completely random. And so sometimes you get a rejection that it just feels like it just came out of left field. You don't even understand the rejection, right? And so it's hard to really take that too personally. It just feels sort of random. And then there's this element to it that is sort of, what is the really popular public policy issue of the day? So for instance, right now, if you propose any kind of project that's scientifically credible, that deals with police body cameras or police killings of unarmed African citizens or African American citizens, very, very likely to get funded, right? And so all of the esoteric research questions right now, they're just not getting funded. I don't care who you are, right? Because there are so many pressing issues. And so those I know are very peculiar issues to criminal justice and criminology, so I don't know how much they span across other disciplines.
I've noticed, that there is a flavor of the month thing that goes on with private funders, foundations, and almost in a faddish way, they will be excited about the kinds of things you just mentioned. The other thing is when you have leadership changes at the top of foundations, the new president, whoever he or she is, has, working with the trustees, of course, has a whole new set of priorities, and that plus what's in the news and what's hot, it helped to dictate, and not to mention where the money comes from and how big the foundation is. If it's a small foundation, it could be some idiosyncratic billionaire who sees the world in his or her own peculiar way. But anyway, so you have to acknowledge all those realities and adapt, but also feel comfortable, of course, with what you're doing and you're proposing. Obviously, you would proceed otherwise.
Can I ask a follow-up on that?
Sure.
Do you run after the money? So, and that goes on both sides. So some of, when leadership changes even within NIH or, if there's certain changes in the government,
And something is suddenly seemingly more fundable. Do you change what you're working on? Do you try to, meet those needs, or do you just wait it out?
Somebody else want a chance? Well, that's a tricky question because it's a question of appearances, and you have to be careful. I mean, the fact of the matter is foundations in America spent between $30 and $40 million, and probably more, looking at influence in politics in the 90s, and that's around the time the McCain-Feingold bill bubbled up in Congress. Is that coincidental? Probably not. In fact, I'm fairly certain it's not. And it is, I mean, on the other hand, my organization was already looking at the influence of money on politics before it got popular. But the fact is, we rode that. We did 3 Buying of the President books. We had a best-selling book. We rode that wave. So that I realized we were riding a wave. Yes. Was I happy to do it? Yes. Did I feel I was doing it only because of that? No, because I had been investigating politicians for 20 years, even in the commercial media prior to that. So to me, it felt entirely natural. But it was like catching a wave, mixing metaphors. It was kind of fun. Sorry. Guys. Yeah.
I mean, in terms of like biomedical, you have to chase the money to some extent, but you can't become a different person to chase the money, right? Okay, so if you're known for being like a person who does this kind of certain type of research, you can't just switch over. It would take too long in science because you have to go do all those initial studies to show now that you're actually qualified to work on that system. But if you don't stay modern and doing these modern techniques, like for me, in my field, optogenetics, it's just light genetic thing. You put channels inside of cells, you can turn light on activate brain cells or heart cells. This is a new technique. If you're not using it right now, you're not going to get the enthusiasm of most review panels and the kind of studies that I do. But that's where you've got to stay with it. You can't just go off and start studying disease X. There's no animal model of disease X. So this is something we face. They also face.
So I don't know to what extent this point is portable across disciplines, but one thing that I run into, I've been running into this now for 20 years, which is, you have public policy funder X that is interested in a certain topic, a topic du jour maybe, right? And I think it may be possible to wrap the study that I want to do in that wrapper. I will give them the product that they're looking for. It's not necessarily a product I'm interested in generating or writing, but it is the vehicle through which I can get the funding to do what I want to do. I just, at this point, consider that kind of the cost of doing business. Now, am I going to change the scholar who I am and the interests that I have? No, I'm not going to do that to chase the money. But we just, in my field, seem to have the opportunity pretty regularly to be able to, you know, it's just paying a little extra. I had to write, I'll just give you a perfect example. I had to write a guidebook for American police agencies this year. And I was very happy to write this guidebook. It was sort of the price I paid to be able to do the project that I wanted to do. And so I was happy to do it. It's a deliverable. It makes the funding agency happy. It serves the policing industry, which is kind of a public service kind of function. And it enabled me to get the funding that I wanted to do the academic work that I actually want to do and that I consider to be, at least for my purposes, the real value of the project. And so for me, it's a win-win all around. It does take some time. It takes some extra time to produce deliverables that aren't necessarily for your purposes, but are for the funding agency's purposes. But I think it's a fair request on their part, and it's just the cost of doing business, and I'm happy to do that.
Any other questions? One question that came up in the last panel was the whole discussion of the relationship between your research, your grant activities and teaching, and how you bring that into the classroom or how it informs your performance as a teacher. Maybe it'd be great to hear from this panel of how you view that perspective. At some universities, faculty will say, I'm a teacher, not a researcher. You know, this school is a teaching university, not a research university, so I'm not going to chase any grants or, you know, put myself out there like that. So, you know, AU is growing its research culture and growing the infrastructure, you know, with the recognition that we're about 26 million right now in award volume in the last fiscal year. So if you have some ideas on this, please share them.
In my own case, having been at the university 9 years, there is now an investigative reporting track for the master's degree in journalism and public affairs. That's new. And we've done 70 investigations, including 8 Frontline co-productions. Frontline is produced in the building next door, and which is the only school in the United States doing that. Do my students get to see these films before they're the rough cut, and do they get to talk to the Frontline producers? Yes. And do we use all of the projects? Do we involve the students in the actual work? We've had 40 students with bylines in the Washington Post. We jointly hired the senior editor of the workshop, who I helped bring to AU after he won the Pulitzer Prize, and he is hired by the Washington Post and American together. First time in the U.S. of any major paper. His students are inside the Washington Post in the investigative team. It's never happened before. So it is integrated and institutionalized in the teaching in our case, and we're kind of excited about that. It's fairly unique, I think.
For me, I have a direct example of this because I moved here last summer and I had to get a class together quickly. President Obama has a thing called Brain Initiative, which is developing new tools in the brain. And made an easy course to talk about tools in the Brain Initiative. So we went through what they were actually funding, and it was mostly grad students, some seniors and juniors in the class as well, new neuroscience major. And we decided to have them form teams and put together proposals. And we had an NIH study section at the end of the course, and they had to come up with an idea to use one of the methods they had learned about and go to a brief proposal. They had a pitch, 1 slide, 15 minutes to make their case, which is what I had to do at Foundation. 15 minutes to talk to this person, tell them what they're doing. That was an interesting way to do things. The undergraduate course, one of the core courses we're doing, it's pretty dry. It's the basics of how cells in the brain work. So these techniques are exciting. So I had sophomores and juniors reading the basic papers at the end of the course. They could do it. It was hard, but they could do it. the course I'm teaching now is using Python, a new language. It's not new, but recent language, and they're learning how to make plots and do the kinds of things you do in a lab report or a paper. So I'm trying to bring those techniques they actually use in a lab to a class and teach them that. So it's been fun. It makes it easy to teach, I have to say.
Right.
So,
Yeah, and some more direct, maybe not in the classroom, but direct hands-on experience with grants. Most of the personnel on my grants are graduate students, so they gain a lot of important experience through working on the grant. In the classroom, I actually learn a lot from teaching upper-level graduate seminars. I get grant ideas for research from teaching those classes because I'm forced to read stuff that I might not normally read, slightly outside of my area, and it sort of keeps me up to date with what's going on in the field of addiction.
Yeah, so it's hard for me to even really conceive of how to draw a line between my teaching and my research because they're just so integrated. And one of the best parts of that process for me has been taking students to foreign countries. And I probably brought, I don't even know, I don't keep track, but probably somewhere in the range of 12 to 15 students to my project down in Trinidad in the Caribbean. I brought students to the Philippines for our study of human trafficking over there. That's been great. I mean, my students are working on all of my projects have students working on them. I have a student right now who just took a project that's kind of struggling and just resurrected it. I mean, just positively just sort of rescued a piece of it. And, you know, she just was able to inject a newfound sense of energy into a project that we just had some struggles. Sometimes these things are difficult to execute logistically, and sometimes you just get, you know, with the right student, just the right colleague, whatever the case may be, whatever team member, you just get that sense of chemistry that just really, really works. And so, yeah, I mean, especially with doctoral students, but even with master's students and the occasional undergraduate student, the project manager who runs the administrative aspect of all of my grants was my undergraduate student 12 years ago. And she started off working as a research assistant on grants, and when she got done with her degree, I hired her as a research assistant professor, and now she's a stay-at-home mom who works for AU and has never been to AU. And she runs the administrative aspects of all of my grants, making things work that I would probably screw up otherwise when it comes to the administrative portions. And so, you know, for me, the opportunity to work with these students and involve them in the research is it's pretty cool. It's a great part of this whole research process.
Any other questions?
What advice would you have for a faculty member who is interested in their first large-scale collaborative project? I'm saying that because for someone who's new, they're working by themselves, they're used to themselves, but when you engage other people, you deal with personality conflicts, dealing with people you may not have known, you know, just to try to make sure you get the best proposal in a timely fashion, and it's something that may be fundable. So what advice would you give someone?
For me, in science, I'd say make sure you go to conferences, make sure you present good stuff at conferences, know people, hang out, whether it's going out for a meal, going to a bar to drink, and being able to know that people are who are good in your field, but also that you get along. And you have to almost, I mean, basically be friends with people to do it in an easy manner. You already know that they're a nice person, so you, hey, of course we all do, but you can figure out a way to work with them that way. But really going to conferences is a huge thing, very important to do. So you have to be doing something interesting that you can present that will give attention to you and to your group, but you have to be willing to go to Europe, go to a national meeting for your field. If you just stay at home, it's very hard to get getting involved with journals and you're going to study sections for NIH has also helped. I've met more people through study sections and NSF panels than probably any other way they could become a collaborator. It's amazing. Around the table, just kind of days of coaching, you know, how they think. And those are just, you got to be active. Step out of the box.
The one thing I would say is, pretty much everything I do as a member of a team, whether as a worker bee on a team or as the leader of a team. Regardless, I really enjoy working in a team environment, and I really enjoy the whole process of assembling the right team or being part of the right team where there's that certain sense of chemistry. And I've made mistakes over the years, and I've sort of made decisions to let people on teams where I had that gut feeling that this is not the right person, the chemistry's not right, the attitude's not right, and I just kind of ignore that gut feeling, and then I really come to regret that later, right? So over the years, I've really learned to sort of trust my instincts on, just building really solid teams. And then, so, we're trained as scientists of one type or another, and so presumably we're really good at the substance of what we do, but it's not like we get training on how to build high-functioning teams and keep everybody happy. And that, for me, has been sort of the big challenge. I've learned a lot about it over the years. When we had our Trinidad project many years ago, this was a giant team. We had dozens of people. And so I just adopted this mindset right from the beginning of the project, and I shared it with everybody. And as of, I think, about a year ago, this sort of dream of mine finally came true, which was I said, all of the undergraduate students who are working on the project are going to, with our help, they're going to graduate and move on to whatever's next. They all became graduate students, by the way. All of the master's students on the project are going to graduate and move on to whatever's next. They all became PhD students. All of the PhD students who are working on the project are going to become assistant professors, right? Get that first academic job. All of the assistant professors are going to get tenure and become associate professors. And as of last year, this last one became true, all of the associate professors will become full professors. It came true down to a person, and it didn't happen by itself. And so, for instance, this is the part we're not trained on, right? And so, we had some folks on the team who were struggling with some of those transitions. And so one of the things that we tried to do is put in place kind of a support network around them, right? So, just if you're going up for tenure and, your bid for tenure is maybe looking a little tenuous, maybe we'll wrap some folks around you, get some collaborative work going, get some papers out there, get some sort of inject some energy into your bid for tenure, that kind of a thing. I had a conversation with a young lady from Arizona State University recently who is a subcontractor, which is a subcontractor for an AU project. She's having a little bit of trouble with her dissertation, ran into her at a conference, started chatting with her about her dissertation, ended up sitting down and helping her run the analysis for her dissertation. And she said, why would you take the time to help me run my analysis? Like, I'm sure you have a lot of things to do. I said, well, you're part of our team. And that mentality of sort of building teams and really trying hard to nurture those teams, including everybody in them at every level, is what makes it creates loyalty, it creates a sort of a unified sense of purpose, it creates people who like each other and want to do good things for each other. And I think that's the hard part. And so I think if you're thinking about collaborating, trying to build that kind of mentality into the collaboration, even thinking through all the small stuff, like remembering the birthdays and all that kind of stuff, I just think it's really important.
Any other questions?
How do I join your team?
I think in terms of beginning to wrap up here, maybe we can start with Ed and work down this way, and maybe give us a takeaway or two from your experience in working with collaborative grants or large grants, and what would you say to this group today?
How I screwed up my very first grant. I didn't think through the administrative aspects of the grant carefully, just the dealing with all the paperwork and the logistics of it, and I am not particularly skilled in those areas. I don't have a good memory, and I don't even like to think about that stuff. And so I made a lot of mistakes with that very first grant. It was a $200,000 federal grant. I repeated those mistakes to a lesser extent with the second grant, also a $200,000 federal grant. By the time I got to the third and fourth and subsequent grants, I started to sort of look in the mirror and say, wow, I'm really bad at this administrative stuff. I'm good at the substance, but the dealing with sponsored programs and budgets and hiring and all of the different rules and performance evaluation, I'm terrible at it. So how do I get better at it? And well, what I decided to do was hire somebody who's good at that stuff and put them on a grant. And I can remember I used to say at some point, if you have a grant that's $500,000 or more, you should always have a project manager. Now I'm down to like, if it's like $100,000 or more, you should have a project manager. So I have right now, I call it the stay-at-home mom club. I've got these 2 stay-at-home moms who are responsible for handling the administrative logistics of all my grants. They're really good at it. And what they do is they make sure we stay on budget, they get all the forms filled out, they keep me on track. Academics are terrible at deadlines. These women have us they have us on target, right, for meeting our deadlines. They're letting us know a month ahead of time before something needs to be done. And just so that logistics piece as a young scholar, I just completely ignored it. Didn't even know it existed. And over the years, they've really learned that logistics piece is really important, especially for preserving your relationship with other sponsored programs offices, administrative folks within the university, and even the funding agency. So having somebody who can perform those functions for you and is very competent and organized, that's the real lesson I've learned over the years.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Early in my, whatever you would call it, this strange odyssey of raising money and doing projects, not here at AU, at the Center for Public Integrity, I was the chief cook and bottle washer, writing the checks, hiring the people. I think I had 2 people, both under 22, were my other full-time employees. We're talking a lot of pizza at 3 a.m. It was a rough period. And one of our big funders was Bill Moyers, who had a foundation. And I had, it was early in the going, and I had missed the deadline. Basically, it was a filing deadline to apply for a grant or something like that. And we had got, when you're doing everything in a small startup mode, you sometimes lose sight or you make mistakes. And so I caught him up, and he said, no, sorry, the foundation has deadlines. And he said, you've got to learn this. You've got it. And I'm a journalist. Journalists have deadlines, but I made a really huge mistake. So the infrastructure, whether it's here with OSP or it's wherever you are, the infrastructure around you is very, very significant. You are putting your name out there that you're going to deliver on all these things. You don't deliver on the back end of the grant, you're not going to get other grants, bottom line. And that means the programmatic part of it has got to be worked out nicely. When I ran the center, I had eight project or program managers on thematic subjects, some of which individually were in the millions for those programs. And then we had a whole fundraising department with several people. And then we had the accountants keeping track of how the money was spent. And then we had annual audits by external auditors. And we have variations of that here, obviously, in different ways. But those systems are essential. And I'm a guy who loves the substance and the investigative stuff. And I'm not into this. Although, if you don't do it, you're not going to get any more money. It's very simple. So I think paying attention to details and the kind of details you don't want to do. And with development, I had a person who had worked in development for 30 years and knew Washington and the whole funding community in the foundation world from all that prior experience. I had the equivalent of Yoda assisting me with that landscape, who just retired for the 3rd time. She said, no more, don't bring me back again. I already did it twice. All those things are essential for this work, and it's not just the personal contact you yourself have, it's your systems. If you get the idea and you may even get the money, but you don't have the rest of that, it's not going to work.
points. For me in science, it seems like being open with potential collaborators and then getting everyone together early is an important thing. So you can be ready to hang out. This is what I want to do. Don't hold back just because they could be in some sense also a competitor. But if you decided to collaborate, do it. Don't have any fear about sharing what you're thinking, but really starting early and getting the institutions together as early as possible. That's all.
One thing I would add is we should spell out roles and sort of ground rules early on. Because I made one mistake with the grant where we had written, with the collaborator, written the whole thing, and then at the end I assumed I would be PI, he assumed he would be PI. So there's some tension. We called NIH, we said we both want to be PI, and they said you can't, you have to pick one. So in the end it all worked out. Basically we agreed that he would be PI, but the first part of the grant I would be PI, the second part. But we could have avoided some of that conflict by defining these roles early on before basically the bulk of the work had been done.
Okay, well, that wraps up the panel. Thank you, David, Mark, Chuck, and Ed. We appreciate your time, sharing your expertise with the group. We hope to do a bit more of this in the future and in additional forums like this. But thanks a lot, so let's give them a hand.